Is that MTV VEMON?
Yeah, Mount Vernon. There's also in your proceedings book, there's a little QR code if you just want to snap a picture of that and get right to it.
Okay, Drew, so because I don't know what a QR code is, I'll ask the first question. What's that? Is that little square?
Yeah, it's that little square, funky, new age barcode.
All right, so questions about weed management? I see one in the back there.
I was wondering for the first speaker, sort of two questions. The first was, does any larger farmer use what I would call just simple sheet composting of cardboard, which is a waste product? And the second question, somewhat related to that, is did you take a look at currently diesel fuels, I don't know, $3.50, $4 a gallon-ish, and they seem to do a lot of cultivation. If the price of diesel fuel doubles, what does that do to the economics of continuing to cultivate?
To answer your first question, no, nobody I interviewed was sheet composting cardboard. There was some use of paper mulch. There was one no-till system. There, vegetable raised beds, permanent raised bed system. They were doing some paper mulching, but not the cardboard. And yes, the second question's very much looming in the minds of the farmers I interviewed. Greater efficiency with tillage, with cultivation, more energy efficient tools, but labor's expensive as well. So a lot of these producers are not inclined to go back to more labor intensive systems with the increase in the cost of diesel fuel. So, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Thanks.
Back there?
I had two little questions. One was about the weed ecology. I kind of missed something, I think. Did you compare the compost to nitrogen and phosphorus singly and nitrogen and phosphorus together?
Yes, when we did the comparison between the compost and the nitrogen and the phosphorus, what we did, well, the phosphorus didn't really work. The idea was to compare them singly and together with a combination of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium all together, but our phosphorus treatment didn't really supply any available phosphorus. And then we also had just nitrogen or just phosphorus or just potassium, but since there wasn't any response to any of them, I just showed all of them together data.
And the other little question was you mentioned life cycle analysis of, no, I'm switching to the plastic, sorry. The life cycle analysis, is that any of that data out there yet?
Good question. That's probably the longest term, collection of data. So I don't think you're going to see very much at this point. But check it out. I encourage you to go to the website and take a look.
Another question on the plastics, just curious with your buried bag studies. You had data for 1 year. Are you continuing to run those beyond the 1 year point?
Question was, how long do we run the mesh bag study? Yes, we have enough bags buried to go the entire length of the study, so we'll go 3 years for sure on that.
My question is for Andrew also. Andrew, when you did the studies on the plastic and the biodegradable mulch cover, did you have irrigation lines also installed?
Good question. Yes, there's drip irrigation under the plastic.
How did that play out?
In terms of biodegradability, it's interesting because if you look across these three sites, there are three, if you think about it, three very extreme sites. Western Washington is very wet, Lubbock, Texas, very dry, and Knoxville somewhere in between, and with the temperatures ranging just as dramatically. So the tunnels have a big influence on biodegradability of those mulches by eliminating the moisture in Washington, maybe increasing temperatures. So the water and temperature are two big factors in biodegradability. And if you're not introducing extra water by having them in the tunnels, generally it's a slower degradation process. But temperature is also very important because even if the two dry sites, like within tunnels, you go to the northernmost in western Washington versus Texas, you saw that there was greater degradation of the PLA in Texas, and that's probably just because of the temperature.
I didn't hear you talk about it, but I saw it in the proceedings, the printed thing, that the biodegradable mulches showed a much lower amount of soil warming than the plastic mulches. Do you think that that is an anomaly somehow from your study, or do you think that it is reasonable to expect like 3 degrees in plastic and less than 1 degree in biodegradable mulch? Setting aside the paper thing, just like Fiatella style plastic mulch.
That's another good question. The temperature differences were at, I believe, just at the soil surface under the plastic mulch. So the normal polyethylene mulch was much warmer in generally speaking. Now, we did see some differences in yield of tomatoes where those were most extreme. But as far as the biodegradability, is that your question on biodegradability?
No, more on soil warming for pushing hot season crops in cold areas.
Yeah. So depending on the location, there was increased yield in the plastic mulch. The data that I showed here was just Western Washington, so it wasn't as extreme, right? They didn't really look different, but they are different in Tennessee and Texas, and I think that's probably why.
Do you think some of that difference has to do with the amount of sunshine you're getting or not getting in Western Washington?
Sure. Yeah.
Again, on the plastic mulches, did you also do a study of sort of biological activity that's occurring in those specific soils that you're using to help explain, like, do you know that, and then is that contributing to how much things are not breaking down?
Yeah. So I didn't present any of those data. We have a soil biology team that are doing greenhouse and laboratory and in-field studies on composition of microbial dynamics. I'd have to refer you to the website again because I don't have those data with me.
What's the advantages of the biological materials compared to the cellulose, which is a biological, but paper versus the bio-based?
Okay, the question is on advantages of the biodegradable plastic versus the cellulose. And if anybody's used the paper, it weighs a ton. It's very difficult to install. You can't use a bed shaper installer with paper. There is a new product that's out that is like an accordion kind of paper that's a little bit easier to deal with, but it's really, really heavy. And it also, I think they're improving it, but another thing that we noticed was that sometimes it degrades too fast and weeds can get through. But another interesting thing was that it shrinks the first time after you apply it. It shrinks, and if you're using holes, to transplant, it can cut off your plants. So just the convenience of using it and with the same equipment that's designed to use black plastic mulch, I think, is the main advantage.
I have a question for Brian and one for Neith. Brian, you didn't mention alfalfa at all. You mentioned rotations just a little bit in weed control strategies, but our research at University of Minnesota shows that for field crops, row crops, having 2 and preferably 3 years of alfalfa in the rotation is by far the most predictable and successful strategy. So did any of the producers in your studies include alfalfa in their rotations?
The answer is yes. They were growing it mainly for the purpose of hay, not so much as a smother crop.
No.
And actually, it's kind of interesting. The 2 farmers that we threw out because they didn't have any weed problems were both growing alfalfa.
There you go.
There you go. You know, sometimes you overlook the obvious. So thanks for pointing that out.
And then for Neith, just your research, you're really looking at heat-treated manure, poultry manure, calling it compost. But I'm wondering if you might think of expanding this research to include real compost that's, gone through a aerobic digestion process, and then also looking at raw manures like liquid hog manure, dairy manure, as well as the heat-treated poultry manure.
Yeah, I think adding in some other kinds of organic fertility sources would be really interesting. We picked the one kind of the composted poultry manure, heat-treated poultry manure, because it's one that a lot of our farmer advisors use at high rates, particularly on their grain farms. But I think it would be really interesting to try and see if we have a similar weed response to other forms of compost. I think there's definitely a lot of work out there in the literature that certain weeds do respond to really high rates of just single nutrients in inorganic fertilizers. So I think it would be really interesting to look at other organic sources as well. Did I say something wrong about that?
No, I just have another question about your trial, and you mentioned possibly manganese and zinc as being, contributing to the response in the compost. And I'm wondering, was there any evidence that the soil was low in those?
I know Corinne Cameron's, one of my advisors said that the Aurora soil is low in manganese. So she thought that there might be a response to manganese there at the first year's field site. I need to look a little bit more at the second year's field site. I do know that the manganese and the zinc is much higher in the poultry manure than it was in any of our nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium sources. So that does suggest that they might have something to do with it also. It's kind of an odd thing to say, watch out for the manganese, oh no, you're giving them too much manganese.
The reason I ask is that we don't usually go around, adding manganese or zinc. Sometimes zinc is in corn starter, but manganese, especially, it's very related to the pH of the soil. So a high pH like Aurora would be lower in manganese. And a low pH soil, like your second year, should have tons of manganese. So that shouldn't be a problem in that soil. But it's very interesting to try to tease out, kind of what's going on.
I think if I were going to do this again, the first thing I would do would be look at phosphorus more, because it seems the most likely culprit. So it would be good to look at other nutrients as well, to get a broad range.
I want to comment before the next question on the alfalfa. I did my dissertation on transitioning, and alfalfa was in one of my treatments, and I had great success with alfalfa, and I got that idea from Carmen Fernholz, and it was one of my better treatments. So using overlapping wide sweeps to kill it prior to the corn, and it worked like a champ. So I highly recommend it.
I have a question for the gentleman from Minnesota's question about the compost. I'm wondering, were you trying to get at the sterile versus living component of the amendment in your question, or at least is that part of it?
Well, yeah, that certainly is. I mean, compost is very different from this heat-treated manure. But then also, another part of it is, I've heard from a lot of farmers that use a liquid hog manure have terrible weed flush immediately afterwards. So I think looking at different types of manures as well would be very interesting.
And the weed flush, that does make a lot of sense too, because one of the problems when you're studying weeds is getting them to grow when you want them to, because they've got a lot of seed dormancy. And one of the ways you get pigweed to grow is you treat it with diurea. So you give it nitrogen and it germinates. So it would make a lot of sense that the pignoid, that it would also stimulate weed seed growth. But I think there's not as much studies on that in particular.
Get back to alfalfa. In the Northeast, because alfalfa has a taproot, and not all of our soils are deep and well drained, so if you go put in, trying to establish alfalfa in some of these New England soils, you lose them after the first winter because the taproot gets broken, they get frost deep. So people tend to shy away from a crop like that, even though it certainly has potential to work very well. Just if you can't guarantee success, then it's kind of a waste of time to seed it down. And there are other cultivars that can do the same thing.
That's exactly the case in Western Washington. I went out there thinking, yeah, I'll get these guys to grow alfalfa. And they're just like, no. But Midwest works good.
If I'm interested in the negative effects of biomulches, am I wrong in thinking that the upstream effects are probably much greater than the downstream, what's left in the soil afterwards?
So you're asking about the production process?
Well, the growing of the corn and all the effects of that, especially if it's conventional, the actual processing of the material.
I wouldn't say you're wrong. Those are things we all have to take into consideration. So that's where that life cycle analysis is going to be very important to see where, all the impacts and footprints in the production system versus polyethylene mulch.
Hi, I have another question on mulch too. Can you comment on the method, the ASTM method for measuring biodegradability, the carbon evolution, and why you can't come up with these, variable numbers when you do your in-field research?
This is a good question, and
Did everybody hear the question?
so the question is about the ASTM standards and where do they come up with that. Basically, there isn't a real one for biodegradable plastic mulch. What that standard that I brought up was about composting of biodegradable plastic. So there really isn't a standard available for this particular product. And this is part of why we're doing the research, because we're not necessarily composting the residual plastic. We're tilling it in, and maybe that's going to compost it, but I certainly am not an expert in that area of the ASTM standards, but I do know that it's a pretty gray area. If you need to look at the standards as they are written, and they don't precisely apply to the product. And I think that's one of the big reasons why we got funded to do the research. Good question.
And what about the inclusion of synthetics in the product itself? You mentioned that's a factor, but what are you finding? Are the manufacturers open with you about that?
That's another good question. No, they're not. And I alluded to this in the proceedings. They, but I didn't mention it here. They have certain proprietary ingredients, right? And if they don't open that up, then there's no way they're going to be available for review. So that is something that we're working on with the manufacturers, that they need to understand. If they're going to make it to this market, they're going to have to open up those proprietary ingredients.
I'll get you in the back first.
Yeah. I was wondering for Brian again, with your study, if you did two related questions. If you did a cost per acre of weed management, and also what I would call people per acre or eyes per acre. I mean, they have one person per acre, or two people per acre, or half a person.
To your first question, there are probably a few places in the recordings where people came up with certain costs. I have not teased that out. That would be a good second pass to go through the interviews and pull that out. But probably a more organized follow-up fashion would be worthwhile. Labor, it's varied from farm to farm, year to year, crop to crop. there was so labor management, eyes to the acre, how the different metrics that you want to use. Some were very capital intensive. Some were just pretty much all hand tools without even any power equipment. So the operations varied in size from a single operator doing everything to I think we did collect data on hired labor, and I think the largest crew we encountered was about 30. So in the peak season.
How many acres was that?
That would have been about 300 acres. So about one worker for every 10 acres. But that was a rotation that included the majority of the acreage was in field corn and small grains, and then in any given year, about 10 to 20 acres would be in intensive vegetable production for retail market.
I was going to ask like Biotel and these things, it's correct that they're European, right? And if they are, how has this issue of proprietary ingredients and them not wanting to say what's in it, how is that not an issue in the EU or in Canada? Or am I basing that on a misperception?
No, you're on that. I can't answer that. It's I did forget to mention that those products are certified in Europe for organic production.
But you don't know whether or not those certifying agencies require to know what's in those products?
I could give you an answer.
Oh.
Maybe you can answer that. I can't answer that.
The European standards are different than ours. They don't. We have this distinction between synthetic and natural as sort of a deciding factor, which they don't. Their standard just talks about biodegradability on mulch. So they have, and in general, my opinion is they don't do real rigorous material review there either. But they've been convinced that it's biodegradable. Brian, you might want to add something about Canada.
I want to make sure everybody heard Emily first. Can everybody hear what Emily was saying? Okay, we're good.
Okay, yeah. One of my hobbies is international organic standards. And, one of the things that I've been discussing with my European colleagues is that I do not believe that biodegradable plastic mulches are allowed under the European regulation. That's my personal opinion. Of course, the competent authorities of most European Union member states disagree with me, but I don't see in the regulation where it's allowed. And I've asked my colleagues where in the regulations it's allowed, and they said they'll get back to me.
As for the biodegradable plant-based plastic, what test is necessary to determine whether any of the starches, etc., or plant-based material is GMO? And if it can't be done, what kind of instrumentation has to be developed yet for? Or if it's not allowed to be done, what people or corporation is saying that no one can determine?
No, it can be done in the plant material. What I meant was you can't test in the final product whether or not that was, whether that's a GMO-based starch or not. There's no remnants of GMO DNA in the plastic product. So I'm sure that what could be done is that just some kind of regulation of the feedstocks that go into the production process, and I doubt that they would. I doubt that they would mind doing that because I know Matterby does claim that their feedstocks are GMO-free. So if that's the case, then I'm sure they would submit to testing prior to production. That's my guess. I don't know.
Follow up to that, I'm going to speak about vinegar tomorrow as a herbicide that's made from GMO corn. And
there's other examples too. Yeah, that's a good point. And my analogy was, conventional manure that comes out of GMO feed. That's allowable. So again, I don't think that the GMO issue is as big a deal according to, and maybe you can help me out here, according to Not Program. She says no one's petitioned for it yet, but I think it's the synthetic additives issue is more of a bigger deal.
Yeah, it's just that it has to go through our process for review. And as far as the GMOs go, that is a gray area that hasn't been, we really have not come out with official policy yet on the degree or that you need to review in a crop input material. So.
Isn't soybean meal an approved organic fertilizer? I mean, it can be any soybeans, right? Roundup ready soybeans?
Well, it depends if you're going with OMRI listed or not. I mean, OMRI has developed its own decision tree that a lot of, that is clearly without question, looking at the potential for some some DNA protein that would have an effect on the environment. But, this is something that NOP has issued some sort of informal policies in the past, and now we have a more formal policy generating position, so we really don't have a good policy on that now. Yes, people are using it, and I don't think they're being, getting non-compliances for it.
Other questions? I just wanted to, in Neat's slides with the huge pigweed, made me remember some information that Chuck Moeller talks about in his presentations about weed seed production. Can you address the weed seed production issue with the huge plants? Just in terms of the proportion of the seeds that tend to go into the seed bank from those huge plants, or maybe Brian too.
I think maybe what you're saying was Chuck Muller, who also had a very large role in this project, in my project. He's got some work on the relationship between height and biomass of plants and how much seed output they have, right? So I guess what you're saying is that if the nutrient input is increasing weed growth that much, it'll also be increasing the input to the seed bank for the next year. So it's competing with your crop in the year that you're applying all that fertilizer, and it's also competing with the crop for years and years later in the future.
Yeah, that was what I wanted to, the point I wanted to Yeah, Rob?
The comment, Abby, about reduced tillage in organic systems. We stopped using mold-bore plow back in '08, and we could, on our 54 acres of vegetable ground, we only use zone tillage now. So it can be done. There's really no need for mold-bore plow anymore, even in an organic system.
So could everybody hear that? It was a comment about Rob going away from mold-bore plowing and what, 30 acres you said?
54.
54. You want to stand up and say
Yeah,
that?
we have about 54 acres in organic production of vegetables, and we got away from mold-bore plowing starting in '07, completely converted in '08, and we're not going back. There's no need for it, really, and I think our weed management is definitely benefited from not turning the soil upside down, bringing more weed seed. It's also, I think, better for the soil, obviously, for the microbiology of the soil. We're not turning everybody upside down. There is a strata there. Everybody has their place in the soil structure. And so by not mold-bore plowing, I think we're doing a lot of good things for that.
What are you using?
What's that?
What are you using instead?
Yeoman subsoilers. 1, 2, or 3 shanks, depending on the crop that we're planting. And then we use either wavy cultures, or for bed production, we just go over with a small rototiller and create a seed bed out here for us.
Thanks. Well, I just realized that I had a wrong idea in my head of when we were supposed to end. We were supposed to end 10 minutes ago. So let's thank all our speakers once more. Everyone for all the great questions and discussion, and